Hey you! Thank you for listening to the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. This episode is sponsored by Sideshift.ai, Starkware, Layer 2 Labs, and Hodlink.ch. Don't forget to subscribe! Hello there and welcome to the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. This is season 15, episode 40-something by the time I publish it. And I'm here in Mallorca with Peter Todd, longtime Bitcoin contributor, former Bitcoin core developer. I'm not sure if he is still involved in writing code, but he's definitely reviewing code. And sometimes he's very critical of what's happening. And I want to ask him, because this is his fourth or fifth time on the show, about all sorts of stuff that happened in Bitcoin lately, from ordinals to BitVM to stuff that might come to Bitcoin like covenants, and stuff that can be built on top of Bitcoin with covenants like ZK Rollups and stuff that you expressed dislike towards like Starkware, and also Drivechains. I want to hear you talk about that. So there's a lot to unpack. Hi, Peter. What are you up to? What do you do these days?
Well, go hang around, Bitcoin conferences and speak on podcasts, apparently.
You're on a full campaign to push for full RBF, and I guess you can talk a bit about that one.
So, full RBF is kind of a funny thing because right now, essentially all miners are running it, as far as I can tell. The only one I know of that says they aren't, for at least some of their hash power, is Ocean, and that's just because Ocean gives you the choice of, either running Bitcoin Knots or mining against a Bitcoin Knots template or Bitcoin Core template. And Bitcoin Knots, of course, says full RBF on by default. But bizarrely, even though this fixes a bunch of issues with transaction pinning and whatnot, Bitcoin Core actually just closed my full RBF pull rec. And it's just one of those things like, dude, you should have just merged this months ago. Why are you creating yet more delays in this stuff? But in fact, also I can probably even say, given that this will probably publish after tomorrow, that I did recently find so-called free relay attack involving full RBF. And, I'm probably not the first person to find this because it's kind of obvious, but if all miners are mining with full RBF and Bitcoin cores are not, obviously that means you can broadcast a series of transactions that use full RBF to get a small transaction eventually mined, or at least in miner mempools, whereas then the Bitcoin core nodes that reject that by default, you can then have them, you can then broadcast a transaction that only they're going to go broadcast. And since the probability of since so few miners are non-full RBF, your probability of the transactions you broadcast getting mined is so low that you can effectively broadcast data for very little cost. Now I got to go point out, this is only one of like 3 free relay attacks I found the past couple months. And frankly, I don't think this class of problems is fixable. Like, we just have to accept people will always be able to go and broadcast data on the peer-to-peer layer at relatively little cost compared to what we want them to. But it's interesting that even with this kind of attack, Bitcoin Core doesn't seem very interested in enabling full RBF.
Yeah, to me it's very interesting because 2 of your friends started the mining pool that you mentioned previously, Ocean. And if I was to judge this politically, I would say that you are going to align with them and declare that the ordinal inscriptions are an attack on Bitcoin and they're a bug that needs to get fixed. But you took the opposite stance, maybe because of your previous experience with open timestamps, and maybe that you are thinking that they could also filter that out. But you're also more free market than I honestly expected in this regard. And you're happy that the miners are making more revenue.
So, full RBF is one of those things where it's kind of the free market approach. It's like, obviously, miners are going to want to have more money. If a replacement exists that pays more money, why wouldn't they take it? And I've been proven correct in that essentially 100% of miners are mining full RBF. Now, when it comes to blocking inscriptions, I think there's the same kind of rationale. Like, there's a lot of money that, frankly, idiots are willing to go put up to go and get all these silly transactions mined. Of course, miners are going to mine them. And also, the nature of the Bitcoin protocol is such that there isn't really a technical way to stop people doing this kind of thing. I mean, it's hard enough to stop people putting data in the Bitcoin chain, let alone prevent people from trading assets with transactions that inherently look just like normal Bitcoin transactions. There isn't a long-term way that this can be blocked. So we should accept that and not waste a lot of development effort trying to stop all this stuff.
And you're also a proponent of tail emission, and you believe that, it's a very interesting assessment because right now, Bitcoin miners are being paid from the inflation that's being generated within the system. We have no empirical evidence that when this inflation is going to get diminished every 4 years, there's going to be a sustainable way for the miners to keep going. Of course, there are these guys who say, yeah, we should just let the miners go bankrupt or something and stop their operations and see what happens after. But that's very reckless. And you have the most extreme of proposals, and you say, let's add this tail emission. And I believe that
there are much more extreme proposals than what I've said in academia. So, I think the Bitcoin world is just not seeing what people understand this stuff are actually researching. But, the bigger point I'd make, though, is that there's this idea, I think, in the Bitcoin world, markets just magically fix everything. And that's not nonsense. Markets go and do what markets do based on incentives. And the problem that we have for Bitcoin is that there aren't clear incentives for decentralized entities to keep Bitcoin secure. And the simple nature is that the way mining works is that it becomes unstable when all of your revenue comes from fees, because you can play games like reorganizing the blockchain to go get fees that other miners didn't. And the problem is, the bigger you are as a miner, the more profitable those games are. And we do not want that kind of incentive. And tail emission is just one of those things where, had Bitcoin be designed with that from the beginning, we wouldn't, maybe to a degree we might have some of these issues, but a lot less. Whereas right now we have this very reckless design of Bitcoin where you start off with Bitcoin working in one way, with subsidy always providing a guarantee that there's incentives to create a new block. And the assumption is, well, we'll just go to the extreme opposite, and we'll just hope it works. And no other cryptocurrency has ever actually survived this transition. There's no reason to think, Bitcoin is going to be magically different there. And ironically, a lot of the people who hate the idea of tail emission the most, they seem to also be the ones who hate the inscriptions, hate all these fee-paying transactions. So, what exactly is these people's plan? I don't get it.
I do agree that these people seem to hate the idea of miners making more money for whatever reason, and they still regard them as evil. I guess this comes from a hatred towards Bitmain that goes back 7 or 8 years.
I don't even think it's about hatred towards Bitmain or anything like that. I think it's just they've bought in so hard to the 21 million meme that they just cannot accept that Satoshi might have screwed that one up. As it is, the idea of having halving is just stupid. Having the shocks to the system. We're lucky we've survived these shocks to the systems, but the idea of putting it in the code base was stupid. It was a terrible idea protocol-wise. But, Satoshi made that mistake. Satoshi also made the mistake of cutting the subsidy every single time. And, we just have to go live with those things and either hope those mistakes don't bite us in the ass or fix them.
Well, you can also argue that if it wasn't for this promise of a fixed supply and this consensus that there should only be 21 million Bitcoin according to this inflation schedule, the adoption would have been much slower, and especially from this libertarian Austrian economist school of thought. Because cypherpunks, I guess, they could find Bitcoin very useful. But these Austrians, maybe they would look at it and say, it's not that interesting because there is no fixed supply.
That's an incredibly stupid argument, because having a supply that grows at a fixed rate is a fixed supply. Had Bitcoin been designed with 50 Bitcoins per block forever, the Austrians would all rally around Bitcoin saying, yeah, it's a fixed supply. Look, 50 Bitcoins per block forever. Much the same way as the same Austrians rallied around gold, even though gold has an even less fixed supply, in that the amount of gold that miners can mine actually can go up quite a lot as technology gets better. But the gold they were willing to say was a fixed supply. It just happens to be that we had this 21 million meme and people rallied around that. And they just cannot step back and look at it rationally and say, all right, what is the economic properties of a system that works a little differently? And the fact is, economic properties of tail emission is a fixed supply. It's a fixed supply of circulating coins. Same thing, Demirage is another example. Demirage, you wind up with a basically fixed supply. There's some subtle differences economically, but it's roughly the same thing. And had we had that from the beginning, that's what the Austrians would have rallied around.
I usually think about Litecoin and the fact that this script coin should have had issues if it wasn't for the Dogecoin, which became much more popular. And it was merged mining that actually saved it because the number didn't go up as expected. They didn't double in price over the last 7 years, I guess. They're still at $60-something right now. And if it wasn't for merge mining with Dogecoin, they could not survive. So,
see, I actually disagree there. It's the real thing that kind of saves Litecoin is that it's so insignificant that no one's going to spend a bunch of money to attack it. This would be a very different discussion if Litecoin was the number one currency. But it's not. It's not because it's not really all that useful, doesn't get much usage. People don't go hold on to Litecoin. So there isn't really a strong incentive to actually go and try to kill the damn thing.
Well, BitPay reported that they have more payments with Litecoin than Bitcoin and Lightning combined. So you say there's no usage, but at the same time, we don't know who's using it.
Yeah, I'm always very skeptical when I hear figures like that. And particularly, who is holding Litecoin? Because after all, what drives the price of a currency is not people doing payments. It's people actually holding the currency. Now, you can argue that one reason to hold the currency is to do payments. But, just as an example on my own, I've on occasion had to go pay for things where Litecoin was the most reasonable option available to me. Sometimes they don't accept Bitcoin at all. Sometimes they go charge fees on it. Well, what do? Well, I use something like flip.me or fixedfloat.io to convert Lightning to Litecoin. It's not me holding Litecoin for any reasonable amount of time. It's me just doing the bare minimum necessary to go pay with that. And that doesn't drive price.
Yeah, you basically mentioned two competitors of my sponsor, which is Sideshift.ai. Check them out.
Does Sideshift.ai still require accounts? I thought they did at one point. Or did they fix that?
That's optional as far as I know.
I mean, flip.me, it just works, no accounts, and you do it over Tor, so I can't speak for Sideshift, but maybe I'll go try it sometime.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Check it out, sideshift.ai. Anyway, I want to ask you about covenants because that seems to be, I guess, the hottest topic right now. People disagree in regards to which covenant soft fork should be implemented. They propose CTV, Opcat. There's another one that I'm missing right now. Anyway, the idea is that
those are the main two. Technically, Zcash any Prevout is a covenant if you jump through a bunch of hoops. And then there's also a bunch of sort of more special purpose covenants. They're essentially variations on what CTV does, like Zcash, TX hash and things like that.
Yeah, there seems to be an agreement that Bitcoin needs covenants to build some new stuff. Are you sharing the same opinion? Do you think that covenants are necessary for Lightning, for Arc, for trust minimized sidechains?
Well, I mean, so you have to parse that question very carefully because covenants are certainly necessary to do certain things on Bitcoin. But there's a bigger question of how necessary it is to do those things in the first place. And, something I've been pointing out to people is like you can go open roughly 1 billion Lightning channels per year using available on-chain capacity. So it's likely you could maintain, in the hundreds of millions of Lightning channels of actual users using it for all their stuff. And while that may not sound like the whole world population, it's a very big chunk of it. And keep in mind, like out of the entire world population, which is roughly 10 billion people now or something, only about 4 billion own smartphones. And if you don't have a smartphone, like you're just never going to participate in Bitcoin directly anyway. So, I mean, it's just not relevant to all those people. What's relevant is the number of people who at least own a smartphone, at least can participate in Bitcoin with with a client that actually has self-custody. And that number, that 4 billion number, there's a good chance it's actually going to go down as world population decreases. Because if you ever looked at fertility rates, like fact is, basically every country in the world, which is halfway developed, is going to lose population and going to lose population quickly. So, how much do we really need to rush into potentially changing Bitcoin in ways that are bad to get covenants for things that are only really strongly relevant when Lightning has a significant percentage of the entire world? I'm not sure what the rush is.
But for some reason, there was this report by Antoine Riard back in November of 2023, and he presented this fatal bug in the Lightning Network, which requires some sort of soft fork to fix.
So he was that's talking about the transaction cycling attack. And a very clear way to fix it is myop expire opcode, which is not a covenant in any way, shape, or form. So, and also, transaction cycling, you can certainly mitigate that to a large degree with changing how Lightning Client works. Basically, the way I put it is like every time you do a round of the transaction cycling attack, the attacker has to go spend money. So provided you have a client designed to force attackers to do a bunch of rounds of the attack, the attackers will run out of money. There are probably edge cases where this isn't quite true, but this isn't a serious enough bug that there's very strong incentives to do a soft fork change. And like I said, the soft fork change you would do is one that has nothing to do with covenants.
I'm not sure if it was this disclosure or the emergence of ARC or other layer 2s. It seems like there's this, what's the word for it? Not resurgence, but there's this movement where ZK rollups are fashionable for some reason with Citrea and stuff like that. And Lightning has lost the spotlight. It seems like it lost steam. There are fewer nodes, there are fewer channels. Maybe for efficiency purposes, they decided to close some of them. But there are not more users compared to last year.
I can't agree. I can't agree with that statement of not more users. Wald of Satoshi stats, as an example, clearly show that number of Lightning transactions per day just keeps going up. The nature of Lightning is that you do not actually need very many nodes and very many channels to support a very large number of users. So it's really no surprise to me that public node stats are going down because there's an enormous pile of interest in running Lightning nodes. I think by a lot of people who had, who just had the wrong idea about them making money through routing, which is not really going to happen when everyone and their brother runs a Lightning node and is willing to route for free. So it's no surprise that's going down. But it does seem that Lightning usage is still going up. And it's not like, switching to ARC is going to magically make the situation any better. Like, ARC has many of the same ultimate problems that Lightning does, expresses some stuff differently, but the biggest problems, I think, are not really about tech. They're about Bitcoin adoption.
I remember reading this blog post by Eli Ben-Sasson, who is a co-creator of Zcash, and now he works on zero-knowledge rollups, and it's called Starkware. And he expressed this idea that he can bring these rollups from Ethereum to Bitcoin, and you're very much against it. And I did not understand clearly your point of view. Was it about miners being able to do reorgs with MEV or stuff like that? Or what is it that you don't like about the idea? Because honestly, I interviewed him, and he told me that you can basically sync a full node with a ZK rollup on your phone, and I think that's pretty cool. And he also brings some...
The way he's talking about syncing a full node, the nature of that math means that you aren't really running a full node in the sense you are today. Like he can go argue you are in the sense of validation, but there's more to nodes than validation. It's also about data publication, ensuring that the data behind Bitcoin is widely distributed. And really good ZK snarks actually screw up the incentives of Bitcoin because I can prove validity of a block to you without actually giving you the block. And that's extremely harmful. Now, I don't think the tech is quite there yet, but you really got to take what all these guys say with a grain of salt because they have huge amounts of investment money riding on this tech being successful. And the fact is that it does change incentives of Bitcoin in negative ways. And that's before I even get into the MEV stuff that will probably come as you get more and more complex financial shenanigans happening on top of Bitcoin.
Okay, but more directly, what's your objection? Because you said that there's a lot of VC funding. You can also say that about Lightning or Liquid or something else. But what is it about their ZK setup that is wrong? Did you look into it or something?
Well, it's not about the ZK setup per se. It's at there's potentially issues with that too, but like the fundamental issues is that the things they're trying to bring to Bitcoin change the incentives around Bitcoin. And that's not necessarily good for Bitcoin users. It may be good for the new users they want to go bring in, but those users aren't us. If you want to continue to do payments on Bitcoin and hold Bitcoin, what do you care about people doing fancy financial contracts for assets that are not Bitcoin? It doesn't benefit you. It benefits investors trying to do a bunch of clever stuff, but that's not you. That's not you doing payments. It's not about number go up Bitcoin. So all this stuff we got to go ask, does this actually benefit Bitcoin users? Now with Lightning very, very, very clearly benefited Bitcoin users. It meant you could go send Bitcoin around the world nearly instantly at very little money. That was not a hard argument. The only decent argument against Lightning was that potentially it would take transaction fees away from miners. And of course, we don't live in a world where miners are paid from transaction fees. We live in a world where they're mostly paid from subsidy. So if you want to fix that, the argument there is you go add Demirage or something, or tail emission, and pay miners that way. Plus, of course, if you do have a Lightning channel, the cost you're willing to pay per transaction can go up a lot because you're using one channel for so many more transactions.
I also want to ask you about Drivechains because it was a big topic. I watched that panel at Baltic Honey Badger last year, and you made a very interesting statement. And I don't want to misquote you, but what I remember from it is that you said that the cost of increasing computation is much lower than the cost of increasing human politics. Yeah. And I don't understand what this means. Is it that you mean that we can always increase the block size if it's needed, or what do you mean by increasing computation?
Well, I'm just saying that if you really do want a block size increase, doing it through an actual block size increase is much less costly than doing it through a drive chain model, which invites politics into low-level consensus. Because ultimately, drive chains, unlike ZK snarks, does not have an actual mechanism in math to determine validity of anything. Drive chains assumes that you ultimately determine validity through politics, through voting. It really comes down, it's really a miner voting proposal where we assume miners will vote on what chains are actually valid and what ones aren't. And that's always going to be political. And it also introduced a very ugly type of politics where miners can easily go vote to accept chains that are invalid and confiscate people's money. Currently, miners don't really have much ability to seize funds. You can kind of argue, they can kind of play games with Lightning channels, but, even in those cases, they need to be a part of the channels. Like, if you and I have a Lightning channel, no matter what miners do, they cannot take the money out of the channel without colluding with at least one of us. Whereas in the drive chain model, if you and I have funds on drive chain, they can just take the money, and that's that. And that's a much lower bar to seizure, especially like government-ordered seizures. And we really don't want miners to be in that position.
Well, but there's always this argument that who are the miners? You seem to have an issue with Foundry being too big and getting too much of the hash rate. But honestly, there was always this argument that you can always become a miner. I can become a miner. We can decentralize hash rate by contributing actively instead of pointing fingers and saying this is too big.
Why do you want to go and take a system where that's already our defense and say, the fact that in an emergency when you do all these incredibly costly things, go try to maybe fix stuff, why don't we just rely on that more? This is like saying, firefighters exist. Why don't we go make all of our buildings out of gasoline? And, firefighters will go fix it. We'll just spray some water on it when they catch on fire. It's like, dude, no, you do defense in depth. It's nice that, you have these options if things go really badly, but you do not want to rely on them. You want to go and not need them in the first place. And the fact is, if all this was true, you would kind of hope that maybe Bitcoiners would have already made hash power get more decentralized, reduce influence of Foundry and Antpool and all this. But that's not how it's played out. Even though this is a risky place to be, because the cost of doing all these things is so high, in particular, even if you're a small miner running a small amount of hashing power, the cost in terms of variability of income is huge. unless you go to some big pools. This is why, as an example, Brains no longer makes their own block templates, because they found they just did not have the consistency of finding blocks necessary for hash power to be properly sent to them. So they wind up partnering with another bigger pool, who's the one who actually creates the block templates. And then Paul Stork comes in and says, well, I mean, this situation is so bad, let's just rely on this even more. It's nuts. It's completely reckless. And unfortunately, I think he's doing this because this is a way for him to go make money, and he just doesn't have any other good ideas in Bitcoin. Like, this is one of his two ideas. One is the prediction markets, which is not really a profitable idea. It's already been done, and there doesn't seem to be a great way to do this with crypto. And the other one's Drivechains.
Well, it seems like Polymarket, which is on Ethereum, is catching a lot of traction these days. I don't want to get into that. It's just that prediction markets seem to have cycles, All of a sudden, nobody cares about them, and then they have a resurgence.
The problem with prediction markets is there just isn't good ways to reliably do them in a decentralized fashion. Because ultimately, the best you can do is turn them into a voting scheme, in which case they're vulnerable to people ganging up and voting the wrong way. At least human-run prediction markets, it's clear who's ultimately deciding whether or not a prediction was true. When you try to do it in a decentralized way, it's really a voting scheme. Who decides who's going to have that pot of money?
I recall reading a tweet by SuperTestnet, who figured out how to create Drivechains using covenants. He used Opcat to construct these sidechains. And I think if we get this Covenant soft fork, we're going to get Drivechains without the BIP 300, possibly.
Well, it depends on what soft fork. I mean, this class of thing is a very good argument against Opcat. It's just such a general purpose tool that can do basically anything, especially if you combine it with a few other scripting changes, that there's very good arguments that we shouldn't implement it. You allow too much stuff. And it's much better to do something simpler like check template verify.
Well, Andrew Polstra said the opposite, that the negatives are outweighed by the benefits, and it's 90% good stuff that's going to come to Bitcoin.
Look, 90% good stuff's all well and good, but the question is, what is the 10% and how damaging is it? And the 10% can be pretty damn damaging. You are dealing with a $1 trillion asset. I mean, what's it now? 1.5 trillion, half trillion. I don't looked lately, but you're dealing with an enormous amount of money. Are you really going to go risk this for people's pet projects when it's clear that we can do Covenant sufficiently good to do a bunch of simpler things that are clearly better, clearly good for Bitcoin with a much simpler Covenant model like CTV?
So, do you agree that CTV is great? Because I recall a couple of years ago when Jeremy tried to go through this activation process, that he got a lot of shit. I don't know how else I should call it.
He got a lot of shit because he didn't bother to do his homework. I mean, the CTV BIP just wasn't good. It had a bunch of examples that were clearly bogus. And, if you're going to go and do a good argument, you have to go and do a good argument. If you're going to do a change to Bitcoin, it has to be well-researched, has to be argued well. And the fact is, Jeremy just hadn't done that. There's also other problems with CTV around fee payments, because CTV is just too restrictive in exactly what transactions it allows to be able to efficiently pay fees in a lot of scenarios. But, when you compare it to something like Opcat, which is both inefficient and enables potentially far more stuff than we want, between the two of them, CTV is a more obvious pick. But, like I said before, this isn't a rush. Like, Bitcoin can already scale to hundreds of millions of users, a very big percentage of the entire world population that could conceivably be using Bitcoin with self-custody anyway. So, we're just not in a position where we have to rush this.
What do you think about the fact that we have Cashu and projects that bring Chami and eCash on top of the Lightning Network? I think it's cool that you can receive money without having any inbound liquidity, and you have some privacy. But on the other hand, it seems like we are reinventing banking. And to me, it sort of defeats the purpose of why I got into Bitcoin. Do you think it's cool? Do you think it scales Bitcoin?
Look, if you don't like it, don't use it. I mean, it's as simple as that. Because we have Lightning that lets you go turn a Xiaomi and eCash token into a Lightning payment and immediately get into your own self-custody, it's people's choice whether or not they use it. The fact is, there are circumstances where Cashu tokens make sense for some use cases, and people who are willing to use that are willing to take on that risk of having custody. In much the same way is that like people use exchanges all the time. People have money stored in exchanges all the time. Well, it's their choice. Like we shouldn't try to go and prevent them from doing that. And in the case of something like Cashu, it's not like we can prevent them from doing it. It's just Lightning software. How would you stop Cashu developers from doing their thing?
You can't, but the market might. I don't know. It's just that it seems like it's overhyped right now.
Governments might. The market isn't going to go stop Cashu because obviously Cashu is useful for some use cases. I mean, I have a Cashu wallet myself. I go use it all the time. And one reason I use it is because there's obviously good privacy with that. And also because by me using it, it provides key anonymity set for other people to also gain good privacy for that.
Okay, so you like it. I also want to ask you about BitVM because it's super interesting. It allows for computation to be made off-chain. And it's pretty interesting. People have been tinkering with it and thinking of ways to build trust-minimized sidechains and stuff like that. I know that you have been thinking about sidechains for longer than a decade, and you're one of the first people to say that Bitcoin needs them.
I mean, maybe I'm missing something more recently, but my understanding is there isn't a way to really build a sidechain with BitVM. The BitVM model is closer to like a Lightning channel, which lets you verify computation, but that doesn't directly allow you to do a sidechain in the way that people normally use that term.
Well, Sergio Damien Lerner, I guess you're going to disagree with him because you don't have a good opinion on him, but I had him on the show and he created BitVM X, which is purposely created to scale rootstock and allow it to reduce some of that trusted model.
Rootstock has had a trusted model for so long. I mean, obviously, once you add trust, there's all kinds of things you can do, but if you don't involve trust and centralization, that's when you get an interesting sidechain. And so far, everything I've ever seen about this has shown that you can't quite do that.
What is it that gets you most excited about Bitcoin right now?
I'd still have to go say Lightning. If I'm thinking pragmatically about things that you can actually use Bitcoin, things that you can use with Bitcoin to do real world transactions, like it or not, Lightning is the way to go. And my suspicion is that time will go show that Lightning was a sort of a fundamental type of mechanism in computer science, in much the same way as that proof of blockchains seem to be a fundamental type of mechanism. And once you've discovered it, there's this whole set of things you can do, and it'll be a very long time before it's obsoleted by anything else. Potentially never. Similar like accounting in general. The idea of accounting was discovered couple hundred years ago, and it revolutionized business, and we've never gotten past it. We may have gone past some of the details of how you do accounting, but the idea of, you go write all this stuff down on ledgers and like think about it that way, that will probably be with us till the end of time. And I suspect Lightning, something like Lightning with that kind of model of channels and something like HTLCs is going to be with us till the end of time.
What is something in Bitcoin that you think sucks and is a waste of time?
Well, V3 transactions. It's kind of a niche thing. It's, ultimately about transaction pinning, but it's just such a clumsy, ugly way to go fix a problem. And it doesn't fix the problem very well. It just says, well, why don't we have a new type of transaction version number that we go put these artificial limits on to try to prevent transaction pinning from happening. Although, because the limits are fairly big, if you use a V3 transaction, even in the best case, like let's say it's typical sort of Lightning case, depending on how mempool fees are, if they're reasonably flat, like I could increase your cost to get your transaction mined by like 5x. That's just an ugly thing to go have. And to do this while also messing with the transaction version numbers, which are quite important for consensus upgrades, without having a clear plan of doing that, when replaced by fee rate, just is so much cleaner and simpler. Like, I think it's, it really says that Bitcoin politics, Bitcoin core politics has gone into a really bad place where people are afraid of calling each other out. people are afraid of stepping on each other's toes, and there's an enormous sunk cost fallacy. People have worked on V3 transactions for a long time, haven't gotten much external review, then they get external review which says, yeah, this is a bad idea, we can do this much better. They say, no, we got to go with this thing. Like, sometimes you got to admit that your idea is bad and to go move on. And I think we'll probably see V3 transactions get shipped, and then we'll just forever have this ugly wart in transaction version numbers where for some reason version 3 is allowed, but there's no difference, and we'll end up with replaced by fee rate in the end anyway.
There are a bunch of people recently who discovered that exchange of emails that you made with John Dillon about 12 years ago or something, and they're calling you a spook. Amir, who is somewhere around here, said that...
The Amir thing bothers me a lot because either he can't read properly or he's just straight up lying, because he was trying to go claim it as like I was working with this Dillon guy to prevent him from getting his CoinJoin bounty. It's like, dude, Dillon donated like 5 Bitcoin to this bounty, and you can easily read this. Just read the fucking leaked emails. It's not hard. But I think Amir knows that if you just go say something on Twitter, people aren't actually going to go back to the original sources and spend the time reading through them, because it's real pain to go do that. And I challenged him on Twitter over this, like, dude, cite your sources, and he just hasn't. So the whole thing's very stupid. But it's been a long Bcash kind of pile of conspiracy nonsense that on BSV as well, and of course they go bring in like replaced by fee in here, which of course replaced by fee, that's a thing that really killed Bitcoin on-chain payments, or I should say Bitcoin merchant payments. Nobody can accept Bitcoin now as a merchant. It's like, dude, you're just so far off how people actually use Bitcoin, but it is what it is.
I've interviewed Rafael Cordon, and he really praised you for open timestamps and advising the Guatemala, right? Yeah. The Guatemala government during the elections, which were contested multiple times, and it was a big deal that they were able to verify the validity of the votes with open timestamps. So can you explain what you did for the government and how this works and how it can be used for the U.S. elections, possibly?
Yeah. To be clear, I wasn't working directly for the Guatemalan government. I was working for, I believe it would be like a subcontractor to the, voting, electoral commission agency. But yeah, what we did, for background, Guatemala, like any sane country, it's a paper ballot system. So you have paper ballots and they get put in boxes, and the boxes are taped shut. And at some point, after the polls close, those boxes are opened up in front of a pile of observers, and people count the vote manually. Now, the result of those per box counts go into tally sheets. Piece of paper, like any other. I think it's quadruple, triplicate, one of those like multiple thing forms, whatever. But the important thing is when people actually physically write down the totals against every candidate in that particular, for that particular box. Then what happens is, since this is like triplicate paper, one copy, of course, gets kept. I think another copy got signed in some other way. And then one copy ends up getting scanned into a scanner connected to a computer that sends the results up to election headquarters. And that's the moment when the timestamping happens. So all of the computerized stuff, that's the preliminary elections results database. And that's when we do the timestamp. That's also when it gets recorded in sort of the main databases that, of course, feed into the TV programs announcing who's winning what. And the relevance of timestamping here it's a little less obvious than you might assume, because in the Guatemalan presidential election, there was voting fraud that happened. But, and I may be butchering this bit, because, of course, I've heard this secondhand from people who are actual Guatemalans. But basically speaking, what happened is the ruling party realized they were going to lose. And what they wanted to do was commit just enough voting fraud to throw out the whole election and get a do-over in another 6 months. Because, 6 months more campaigning, maybe they'll win next time. Well, with open timestamps, it was one piece of evidence that showed, hang on a second, nearly all the country, the ballot boxes are getting opened and counted when we expect them to, right after the polls closed. Usually within 10, 20, 30 minutes. Counting a pile of votes is not hard. It can be done very quickly. But in some parts of the country, this scanning process happened hours later. And on top of this, we have eyewitness evidence saying that the boxes were stolen and returned later. And we have video footage evidence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And timestamps, of course, were just one part of many pieces of evidence saying, yeah, there was voting fraud that happened there. And, of course, some of the pieces of paper there that even have ridiculous things like the numbers crossed out and new numbers written. Like, dude, come on. But for most of the country, open timestamps is one of the pieces of evidence that said, yeah, all the other votes were done correctly, and the part of the country with voting fraud was small enough we don't need to rerun the elections. And long story short is after months of agonizing legal bullshit and people I worked with, some of them fleeing the country, some other people in the election commission getting arrested, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, the party who won legitimately finally got into power. But, it took a while. And fortunately, open timestamps was there to add one more piece of evidence to let this whole process happen. And since then, my understanding is Mexico, they have a very similar system, the way it's all organized. They also had the results timestamped, although not as officially as with Guatemala. El Salvador really should have, but my understanding is in El Salvadorian politics, they didn't really want to mix up the election with Bitcoin because from sort of the external anti-Bitcoin, anti-Bukele, from that kind of side of things, they think, oh, they're using Bitcoin to steal the election, and they just didn't want to touch it. And maybe this stuff will wind up in parts of the U.S. election too. But we'll see.
Something for which you never get credit is that you indexed with timestamps the entire Internet Archive, and that was in 2016 or something. And I just want to get it on record because I guess you get a lot of hateful comments sometimes, but you did some very cool stuff that doesn't get mentioned. But how does that work? How do you timestamp the entire archive?
Well, so they had, archive.org had an API that let you download metadata for every item in their collection. And while it's not publicly accessible, the metadata is available for their web crawls. So, every time the Wayback Machine does a web crawl, that gets collapsed into big files, essentially of many different web crawls. And that metadata is available. Plus, the Internet Archive, it's not just about like the Wayback Machine, it's not just about websites. It's also about things people upload. So there's many, many, many sources of data of all kinds of things, scans of magazines, like videos. It goes on and on and on. Old computer games. All this stuff the metadata is available. So, of course, I download all the metadata. I put it into a giant Merkle tree, and I just timestamped it. And then I created software to make those timestamp proofs available for every single item of metadata in the, not quite the entire Internet Archive, because due to flaws in the archiving system, not all the metadata could actually be downloaded. And then I also added a system that at least tried to watch new things as they came in and then also timestamp them. Unfortunately, I just didn't have the budget to do this fast enough with fast enough computers to actually keep up. So in the end, I gave up because I was, my server running all this was falling behind. But I'd love to go revisit that with better software and faster servers. So, and it's been quite a few years now, and one of the things that has changed a lot is NVMe SSD drives are much easier to get, and they have far higher I/O bandwidth than the stuff I was using back in the day. So it would actually be much more feasible to do this project again.
No. And it's really useful, even though it's not the data per se, it's just timestamp to prove that the data existed there, right?
Yeah, well, essentially, the way it was set up was that any file in the entire Internet Archive, you could go and paste in the SHA-1 hash of it, and you would get back an open timestamps proof. Obviously, some of them would go fail because I couldn't get quite 100%, but for a while it was pretty good. These days, of course, I've missed a lot in the years since, but I would love to do that project again. I just need funding ultimately for dev time and to buy the servers necessary to do it.
Let me ask you a question to get you canceled. Name 3 cryptocurrencies that are not scams and might be interesting.
Well, I mean, Bitcoin is an obvious one. Monero is an obvious one. And then it gets kind of hard. Kind of Zcash, although it hasn't really caught on enough. But yeah, that's probably your best 3 that you can give an example of. If you asked me to do a 4th, it would be very difficult. Very, very difficult. 3 is not too hard. 4 is very hard.
It's interesting that you still like Zcash. You are part of that ceremony. I happen to own that laptop, and I'm going to hold on to it because it's a very nice cypherpunk artifact. But for a while, I guess you were not in good terms with the guys, and maybe it was personal.
It was more than personal. I mean, one of the Zcash people, tried to go falsely accuse me of rape to go and get back at me for pointing out the trusted setup hadn't been done properly, among other things. So, some of those people are just fucking nuts. But, it is what it is. I'm not going to say that the tech is bad because the people behind it are just straight up crazy. So the fact is the Zcash tech is interesting. It would have been more interesting had more competent people and less, more sane people being behind it. But the tech is still interesting. And what I've heard is Monero is looking to adopt the same kind of proof that Zcash has. The technical details will be different, but the important thing from the point of view of the users is that the anonymity set for Monero transactions with this potential upgrade that might happen would be the entire set of coins. And that's always been the thing that Zcash had that no one else did, anonymity set truly of all possible coins. Modulo, of course, timing issues. I mean, good example is in this one, the failings of Zcash, because it's got so little use. If you deposit into Zcash and then go spend Zcash, a couple hours later, if I know roughly when you might have done that, I can, of course, narrow down the potential set of Zcash transactions quite a lot because there just aren't that many per day. Now, Monero has enough usage that once they add this every coin could have come from everywhere, that'll be quite a nice privacy improvement. Currently, Monero is really like CoinJoin with some improvements, but with this, they could do a lot better.
Did you have time to look into the Mimble Wimble extension block that they put on Litecoin? I think it's pretty interesting because they have addresses. They have this peg in, peg out system that is just like on sidechains.
So they actually hired me to go do the review of this. I never actually sent them the bill because there wasn't really much for me to actually say about it. It was useful. But the big problem with this is Mimble Wimble just isn't that interesting technology. It's ultimately kind of like a coin join. It just doesn't, and because of how the coin joins are created, it doesn't actually provide very good privacy. So, and the other thing too is I think people have often had a misconception that Mimble Wimble provides really good scaling, and it just doesn't do as well as people think it does because it doesn't let you, people think it lets you combine all transactions into one, but it's not true. It lets you combine many things into one, but you're still left over with a certain amount of data, essentially per transaction, that can't be compressed away. And that data adds up.
You've been in Bitcoin for about 14 years or something.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you, where do you see Bitcoin in the next 10 years in terms of technology? What do you think is going to be the next big thing? Are we going to be using ZK proofs more, or do you think there's going to be some new sort of cryptography that's going to make transactions smaller?
I think the most likely big change that we would see in terms of what average people use it is probably something like Arc. And even then, there would probably be Arc being used to then run Lightning channels. So I do not see Lightning going away. Arc might be a basis for making Lightning channels a bit more convenient and having less on-chain impact, but doing better than this is hard. A good example of this is ZK proofs don't, for average sort of retail, if you will, use of Bitcoin, ZK proofs don't help that much because they still can't make your transactions confirm quickly. Lightning is what you need to actually do an instant confirmation. Just doing ZK proofs and say a ZK proof blockchain doesn't actually get you that. So it ultimately is very hard to beat Lightning's model. I mean, when you get down to it, if you want the fastest possible transactions, ultimately you're limited by speed of light. And if you're in an environment where you're limited by speed of light, you have to have something like lightning because you're actually routing between physical entities. And speed of light isn't that fast. If you want like the instant payment experience, you're going to wind up with something either custodial, like the eCash stuff, or something like Lightning with very fast routing.
That sure is fascinating. Thank you very much, Peter. And what are you currently working on, and where can people follow that?
Well, I talked about this earlier today. I'm still working on the replacement fee rate stuff with Libra Relay. I've got this big paper I'm writing comparing like L2 protocols and covenants and so on. I'd really like to do more work on open timestamps, but currently I'm trying to find funding to go do the stuff I want. I applied to OpenSats and got rejected for that, unfortunately, but there's probably a way somehow. So, I think that mostly covers it.
Thank you very much, and best of luck.
Thank you.
Hey, you. Thank you for listening to the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. This episode is sponsored by Sideshift.ai, Starkware, Layer 2 Labs, and Hodling.ch. Don't forget to subscribe.